Hello, I'm Mercedes Johnson, and welcome to the UX Business Architect. Today's episode is going to be about creating a discussion guide, the do's and the don'ts. Let's dive in. When you're first starting your engagement with your client, it's very common to kick off with stakeholder interviews. When preparing for a stakeholder interview, you'll want to put together a discussion guide. You do this because you want to make sure that you understand the expectations of all of your stakeholders, and you want to make sure that all of your stakeholders are on the same page. First, let's talk about what a discussion guide is. Researchers use discussion guides to standardize their questions across stakeholders. This is important because you want to be able to compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges. By asking all of your stakeholders the exact same questions, it will make it easier to analyze the findings after you're done. Some things to keep in mind when creating your discussion guide is that you want to include both qualitative and quantitative questions, because these will help you understand feelings and values and things that are a little bit more difficult to measure. For example, a qualitative question that you might ask is, can you describe a time where you felt particularly satisfied with X product? As you can see, this question isn't necessarily something you can measure, but it is equally as important to your research. In addition to qualitative questions, you also want to include quantitative questions. For example, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend X product to a colleague? By asking quantitative questions, it gives you data that you can transform into statistics. Both of these question types are equally important, so you want to be intentional to include both quantitative and qualitative in your discussion guide. One thing that you'll want to avoid in your discussion guide are double-barreled questions. This is when you ask two questions in one. For example, how satisfied are you with the accuracy and speed of our customer service? This question is double-barreled because it asks about two distinct aspects: the speed of the customer service and the accuracy of customer service. The respondent might be satisfied with the speed, but not necessarily with the accuracy. This makes it difficult for the respondent to form an answer. It's best to split it into two separate questions. Another thing that you'll want to try and avoid in your discussion guide is including leading questions. An example of a leading question would be, do you agree that our product is better than our competitors? You'll want to avoid these kind of questions because it implies that you're looking for a certain answer. This will lead to biased response and inaccurate insights. Before you begin selecting questions for your discussion guide, you'll want to put together a hypothesis and establish objective statements. A hypothesis is important because this serves as a baseline when you are conducting your analysis and your findings from your discussion. For a 1-hour interview, I typically limit myself to a maximum of 3 objective statements. My objectives are basically used for me to understand what it is that I hope to learn out of this interview. It's important to establish these before you begin picking your questions because you want to make sure that you are maximizing your time with your respondent. An example of an objective statement is to understand the primary challenges and pain points experienced by users when navigating our website. By forming your objective statement in this way, it gets you thinking about the different questions that you can ask in order to get a full answer to your objective. You can't just get the answer to this objective by asking one question. You have to approach it from multiple different angles. This will help you in choosing what questions to include in your discussion guide. All right, so you put together your hypotheses and you created some objective statements. Before you jump into your questions, you'll also want to create a small script. In this script, you'll introduce yourself, state the purpose of the interview, and it'll be a great opportunity to ask for permission to record the call. This will be helpful for future note-taking purposes in the case that you don't have a note taker or you have to go back to get quotes for a deliverable later on. In the case that the interviewee says that they do not want to be recorded, you have to respect their wishes. This is where a note taker becomes handy. Having an additional person to come into the interview with you, specifically there to take notes, will make sure that you can capture all of the details that you might have missed as you were conducting the interview. I usually start my interview by saying, "Hi, I'm Mercedes Johnson, and I'm going to be interviewing you today. Thank you so much for your time. The purpose of today's interview is to better understand your goals and expectations for this engagement. I'd like to encourage you to be open and honest with your answers. We want to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'd also like to ask for your permission to record this call. I promise that the recording will not go beyond the confines of the people on this call. It is purely for note-taking purposes. Do I have permission to record?" From that point on, if the user says that I can record the call, then I'll hit the record button and jump into my questions. Having the script at the beginning helps to establish a level of comfortability and begins building on trust with the person that you're interviewing. Remember, you might be asking them some pretty sensitive questions, so you want to make sure that you're open and honest about the purpose of your questions and where their responses will be used. Next, I want to talk about interview etiquette. There's a few things that you want to do to maintain a level of professionalism and make the person that you're interviewing feel comfortable. It's already kind of awkward to talk to a person for an hour that you've never met before and answer a whole bunch of questions, so it doesn't really help when you have about 10 people staring at them while they do it. So make sure to turn off your camera unless you are the person asking the questions. There should typically only be one person asking the questions because you don't want to hand off the person that you're interviewing to multiple people. So establish who will be conducting the interview at the beginning and make sure to maintain that person through the entirety of the interview. Unless you are the person interviewing, everyone else on the call should have their mics muted and their camera off if you're in a virtual setting. This is important because you want to make sure that the person you're interviewing feels comfortable and mimics a real conversation as much as possible. Could you imagine sitting in a room and having 10 people stare at you while you ask a whole bunch of questions? It would feel like an interrogation. And as you transfer that onto the online setting, that doesn't change. So keep that in mind for the person that you're interviewing. Another housekeeping item is your display name. Unless you are the person interviewing or the person being interviewed, you will want to ask everyone else to change their display name to their role. So, if you have multiple note takers, ask for them to change their display name to note taker, and if you have multiple visitors, ask for them to change their name to visitor. The last thing that you want is for someone who's being interviewed to recognize someone on the call and that keep them from being open and honest. As a researcher, you have to be considerate of the different literacy levels of the people that you may be interviewing. The best rule of thumb is to keep all of your questions at a 7th grade reading level. That means not using words that are too big or complex. You also want to keep your questions short and concise. Your goal in this interview is not to be the person talking, it's to be the person listening. So by keeping your questions short and concise, your respondent will know exactly what it is that you're asking, and you can get through all of your questions in a timely manner. You want to make sure that you're asking open-ended questions and not close-ended questions. Close-ended questions are the ones that someone can answer with a yes or a no. Open-ended questions are questions that someone has to explain. An example of an open-ended question is, "What are your thoughts on the current features of our product?" They can't answer this question with a yes or a no. By forming your question as an open-ended one, it encourages the respondent to share their experiences and their opinions with you. When you're putting together your questions, you'll want to put them into different categories. Some typical categories are introduction, current state, future state, pain points, and closing. But this isn't always the case. It's just a standard template. I personally like to organize my questions by my objectives. So I'll have an introduction, objective 1 questions, objective 2 questions, objective 3 questions, and then my closing questions. 2 categories that are pretty standard are going to be your introductory questions and your outro or closing questions. The introductory questions are usually to help establish that initial relationship and get them warmed up to the questions that are coming after. This might look like, what's your name, your title, your occupation, how long have you been in the role, etc. Some closing questions might be, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you would like to share? Is there anything that you would like to elaborate on further? Is there anything else that you would like to mention before we close the call? As we go a level deeper, another thing that you'll want to consider is the order of your questions and how you transition from one category to the next. Remember, your goal is to make this feel as normal and natural as possible. So you'll want to run through these questions and make sure that it sounds natural. The last thing that you want to do is practice before you do the real run. And now you're all set. You have everything you need to create a professional discussion guide for user and stakeholder interviews. If this content was helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next time.